Hello and welcome back to Autism Unpacked, the podcast where we get honest about what it really means to raise, support and understand autistic people. Today's episode is all about clearing the air. We're diving into some of the most common and frankly damaging misconceptions about autism. You've probably heard a few of them before. Everyone's a little bit autistic, or autistic people don't feel empathy. These ideas might sound harmless, but they can lead to real harm, especially when they stop autistic people from getting the understanding and support they actually need. To help us unpack the truth, I'm joined by Dr Freya Spicer-White, a consultant clinical psychologist and the Chief Clinical Officer at Options Autism, who's here to bust some myths and shed light on what autism really is and what it absolutely isn't. Let's get into it. Hi Freya, welcome back.
Hi Rosie, thank you for having me.
It's lovely to have you here today.
I'm excited to bust some myths.
Bust some myths,
Yep.
Yes.
Everyone is a little bit autistic. We begin by tackling this phrase, which many of us will have heard, but which ultimately can feel minimising and unhelpful for autistic people. We unpack what autism really is, how the spectrum works, and offer better ways to respond when someone shares their diagnosis.
Okay, so Freya, let's start with my favourite. Everyone is a little bit autistic. Now, I know and you know that when people say this, they don't mean to be condescending, they don't mean to be patronising, but that is how it can feel a little bit because we're not all a bit autistic, are we?
No, so my favourite response to that is if somebody says, oh, everyone's a little bit autistic. I say, no, actually, being autistic is a little bit about like being pregnant. You can't be a little bit pregnant.
I like that.
You either
Yes.
are or you're not. And I think that's a really kind of helpful way for people to conceptualise it. So I think it started with people trying to be good, so as you were saying, well-meaning or recognising that they have some traits for themselves. So if you think you might have a few traits, you might think, oh, well, you know, I'm kind of a little bit on the spectrum. And I think that concept of a spectrum allows us sometimes to think that, you know, it's an ongoing spectrum where that you eventually get, you know, high, you know, lots of autistic needs here and then no autistic needs here and everybody's somewhere on that spectrum. And actually that's not what the spectrum is. I like to conceptualise the spectrum more as like that colour wheel.
Yes.
So, you know, everybody's in this, everybody can have their own unique profile. But yeah, I think for me that word or that myth, everybody's a little bit autistic. No, you might have some traits, you might have some, you know, similarities, but only, you know, autism is a distinct separate thing. And actually it cannot be helpful, as you were saying. Some people might find that patronising or it might be quite unhelpful.
I was thinking, and in your sort of professional capacity, how is this unhelpful? Does it prevent people getting diagnosis because they feel like, well, everybody is, so there's no point in me seeking help? And I'm wondering as well if it kind of makes people feel like if they are not coping well, but if everybody's a bit autistic, why are they finding it so difficult? Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I think that's definitely the case, Rosie. So I think there's definitely that aspect of, do you know what, if everyone's a little bit autistic, then why is a little bit of my autism causing me so much problem? Why can I look at everybody and they're not having any problems with things like opening their mail or, you know,
emails,
all those things, whereas an autistic person might be. So yeah, I think it can be unhelpful in that, and it sometimes minimises it as well. Oh, you know, it's only a little bit of this or it's only that, and actually it can be an unhelpful way of understanding that significant difference, especially if you face, you know, numerous challenges or there's numerous barriers to you accessing the world, and somebody saying, yeah, well, everybody's a little bit like that, aren't they? It kind of can minimise that feeling for them.
And what if you are the person who has said this in the past and you're thinking, oh my goodness, I wish I hadn't said this. This is what this podcast is about. We're about helping people learn.
There's no judgment. You know, when I started practicing, I would always say, you know, a person with autism, because that was how we spoke about it at the time. But now, you know, we've spoke to lots of lived experience people who actually prefer identity first, so an autistic person. So, you know, things are evolving. How we talk about things are evolving. There will be things that you may have said in the past that have been unhelpful, but hopefully through, you know, our conversation today, people can feel a lot safer in the conversations that they're having. And if you're not sure, ask somebody.
And what might be an appropriate response if somebody comes to you and says, oh, I've been diagnosed with autism, and your gut instinct is to say, oh, you know, I'm a bit autistic. Is there a better response that people can give? Would it be, I'm really interested to learn about the condition.
Yeah, exactly. So if somebody said it to me, I might sort of say, almost thank them to telling me. So, do you know what? Thank you so much for sharing that with me. That's really important information. And I'd also honour the fact that not every autistic person is the same.
Yes, because even if you're autistic yourself, to say, oh, me too, doesn't mean that we're sharing the same lived experience.
It is, yeah. So it might be, okay, so tell me a little bit about how that impacts you.
Yeah.
Tell me a little bit about what that means to you.
Really helpful, that.
Yeah,
Thank
what's
you.
important.
You don't look autistic. This is a classic we hear a lot. But what does an autistic person actually look like? And why does it matter if we expect autism to have a certain face or behaviour? Let's dive in and hear why it's so important to move away from generalisations and use more positive language.
Another classic. You don't look autistic.
Ah, yes. Because
what does an autistic person look
well,
like, Freya?
clearly there's a very specific idea, isn't there? And I think that's I think that's also something, it can be said as if, or sort of well-meaning.
Compliment, yeah.
Well, you don't look autistic, but actually what does that mean? And I think that's something that we definitely need to stop, people start moving away from. It assumes so much. It assumes that autism looks a specific way that maybe isn't a positive way. It can be derogatory in that sense. It can also, if you're thinking about, some of the more typical things that maybe an autistic person might do. So things of stimming, walking on tiptoes, putting their hands over their ears. There are some things
defenders,
there are some of those things that actually an autistic person might do or might look like. But again, we don't want to overgeneralize. We don't want to kind of paint everybody with the same brush. And we also don't want to think about it from that negative perspective. So, actually, you're not as autistic as some people, or you're not doing it in that way, or you don't look that way.
And that's almost like a sort of reverse stigmatising, isn't it? Because people who don't present in a typically autistic manner may not get the support or may not be believed when they divulge their diagnosis.
Yeah, exactly. And again, if you're really high masking, it also could hinder, because they could almost think that person might be like, oh, I'm faking being neurotypical. I'm doing it well enough, so I'm going to keep doing that because apparently I don't want to look autistic.
Yeah.
And actually, if we can celebrate autism, say, you know what, let's all be our own version of it.
Autistic people don't have empathy. In exploring this myth, we hear why this blanket statement is not only inaccurate and outdated, but how it can also be deeply hurtful. Empathy can look different for each person, and lived experience is reshaping our understanding of autism in powerful ways. Here's how.
What about autistic people don't have empathy?
Oh, now, the biggest thing I have problem with that statement is the blanket nature of that statement. So it's not necessarily fact or fiction. It's the whole thing that we are tarring all autistic people with that same brush. Again, it's kind of saying, this is just how it is. Autistic people don't have empathy. So I know there will be autistic people out there who don't have much empathy. And that's fine. That's how their autism is for them. That's how their personality is. And there are autistic people out there who have incredible amounts of
Almost
empathy.
too much empathy.
Yeah. Exactly. They can really feel, what other people are feeling. I've worked with people who, when, someone would get upset, an autistic person would get upset with them, because they feel the other person's pain so intensely. So again, I think that it kind of comes from the historical diagnosing that, we would look for certain things in terms of social communication, and people would sort of tar again all autistic people with that same brush of they don't have empathy, so they don't understand other people's emotions. They don't understand other people's social intentions. They don't understand those things. So it comes from sort of the old diagnostic criteria, so you can kind of see why people may think that. But again, it's just an unhelpful way. So if you think about one person, I love that phrase, if you've met one autistic person, you've met one autistic person. Some may have empathy, some may not.
And I'm also thinking about the way autistic people might present, and you might be feeling an enormous amount of empathy, an enormous amount of pain, emotional pain. But because your face might not represent it in the way that perhaps a neurotypical person might, it can look like you'll have no empathy.
Yeah.
And I think that so much of neurodiversity happens internally. Yes. It's not visual.
No, exactly. So empathy can look different as well. So I think that's a really good point.
And autistic people are perfectly capable of forming relationships as well and having loving friendships, romantic relationships, families. And I think this idea that autistic people don't have empathy portrays them, or us, as cold and unfeeling. And I think that in itself is quite a damaging thing to have.
Yeah. And it can become a self-fulfilling prophecy as well. If you tell somebody, oh, you don't have empathy, or you don't feel things, or you don't understand, then that can almost become your narrative. And I think it's important to, help people blossom into whatever they're going to become.
And also to remember that that words and actions will have a hurtful impact as well.
They do, yeah. Yeah, the words we choose to use are really, really important. And I think that for me, sometimes I don't think I realised the importance of it until I started thinking about it and talking to lots of lived experience experts who were able to kind of really think about, why words are important, how we describe something can drive how we think about it, how we feel about it.
And is that a way that research has changed, is in that researchers and academics and doctors are talking to people with lived experience as opposed to referring to the textbook all the time?
Definitely. And I think what's even more exciting is now there are lived experience researchers.
Yes.
So there are people who are going into the field of neurodiversity research because they're neurodivergent and they want to, they're bringing their own ideas, their own perspectives. They're looking at things from a completely different angle. And that's allowing us to learn more. And it's why it's such an exciting, evolving field at the moment.
Autism affects boys more than girls. It used to be thought that autism affected boys more than girls. But it's a misconception that stems from outdated diagnostic criteria and the fact that autistic girls and women often present very differently. Listen in to how our growing understanding is helping to close that gap and avoid misdiagnosis.
Is it true or is it not that autism affects boys more than girls?
So that's a really good question, Rosie. So we know that there are more boys diagnosed as autistic.
That's the key word.
And historically, again, it was very much thought that it was a condition that affected more boys than girls. However, I would suggest the more we're learning about autism in girls and the more we're learning about the different presentations, then actually it's probably going to be more 50-50 as we learn about those differences. Because our initial understanding of autism was often based on case studies of young autistic boys. So when we were looking for creating diagnostic criteria, we're creating it based on how those boys were presenting.
And is that because often girls present differently?
Yeah. So girls might present in a subtly different way that maybe boys might be more obvious. They might be more externalizing their behaviours, whereas girls would be more likely to internalise their behaviours.
And mimicking social cues, eye contact, clothes, makeup.
All of those
We've got a lot
things.
of weaponry as girls.
We have. And that's broad brushstrokes. I've worked with autistic boys who have, a more classically female presenting, but I think there's all of those different things. It's about, again, coming back to what we said at the beginning, it's about individuals, it's about really understanding how each person is different.
And because of this historical bias, if you like, has that impacted on girls getting diagnosis or parents, teachers spotting the signs early?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, we definitely see that. And that is starting to shift now. We are starting to see that there are more people with, that greater understanding. But yeah, I think the more that we know, I suppose the more we know, when we know better, we can do better.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think it definitely has impacted women that wouldn't come forward for an assessment when they were younger because they wouldn't have been diagnosed. They wouldn't have got a diagnosis.
And I think as people have their children diagnosed, they start to think, oh, hang on a minute, I did that as a child. And that consequently leads to more diagnosis.
Definitely.
Thank you.
Do vaccines cause autism? This is one of the most persistent and harmful myths. Extensive research has shown there is no link whatsoever, yet this misbelief still gains traction, negatively impacting the whole autistic community. Let's hear why evidence-based reassurance for families matters so much.
Vaccines. Do vaccines cause autism?
No, They do not.
There we go. We have a categoric answer.
There is a categoric answer. So there's been a massive study in Denmark in 2019 which studied over 600,000 children.
Wow.
Because they were looking into this, and there was no correlation, or they absolutely were able to say no, vaccines do not cause autism. So,
and again, it's damaging propaganda in terms of a parent who might be struggling with the acceptance that their child is different to how they expected. And then they think, well, it's my fault. I gave them the vaccine. And it becomes something that's problematic. You don't want them to be autistic. Therefore, it's something that has caused it and needs to be fixed, which is pretty damaging for the autistic community as well. Yeah. People are up in arms saying, well, I don't want that vaccine because I might turn out like them. That's not a nice narrative.
It's not. No, it's done so much damage.
Is there a possibility that the rise in autism at the similar sort of time of the vaccine coincided with more research into autism?
Definitely, yeah. I would say there's definitely that. The more that we know, the more we're able to. So
there's more diagnosis, but it's actually completely separate to the vaccine.
Yeah.
Thank you. I think that's really interesting, because there'll be parents who are considering whether or not to vaccinate their children. There'll be parents that wish they hadn't, or haven't because they were unsure. And I think sometimes you just need to hear it from somebody that is involved in this world who can categorically give you an answer. So thank you. That's really valuable.
Is autism caused by bad parenting or trauma? Now we unpack another outdated and harmful idea that autism is caused by bad parenting or trauma. We explore where these myths came from and why they've been thoroughly debunked.
Is autism caused by bad parenting or trauma?
So, again, no. Originally, when autism was first thought about, it was actually thought to be caused by refrigerator mothers. That's what they actually.
What's a refrigerator mother?
A mother who is very cold, who doesn't hug their child, who is very sort of.
Oh, wow. So the mother got the blame, of course.
So the mother got the blame, yeah. So they called it was caused by refrigerator mothers. Now, if you think about what maybe a scientist would have seen, a refrigerator mother was just seeing probably an autistic mother. So we know now there's lots of research going into genetics. There's lots of research that's gone into, generally how autism presents across families. We know that it isn't caused by bad parenting. That's not to say that you can't be a bad parent and have an autistic child. I'm sure you can. But actually, we know that it's not caused by that. And we know it's trauma. We know trauma can exacerbate autistic traits. So if you were an autistic person who has experienced trauma, then you may have more heightened sensory experiences, you might have more anxiety, so there might be experiences that you have that are exacerbated by the trauma that you experienced. You might even have experienced autistic trauma, which is the trauma of, that you've been trying to fit into a neurotypical world and you've been exploited as a result of that, or, there's lots of different ways you may experience autistic trauma.
And I'm thinking about trauma and it impacts. And if you've got somebody that's very high masking, and I'm going to use myself as an example here, and then I experienced an enormous life trauma, and the only way I can describe it is I was unable to hold the mask up anymore.
Yeah.
So all the scaffolding, all the compensation I had done for 30-something years on the planet fell away. And what was left was the kind of real version of it. And I've spoken to other people who have, either their children have or they have experienced trauma, and it has brought about an autism diagnosis. Mm-hmm. So I suppose you can sort of see where people might assume there's a link, but actually what you're saying is that it exacerbates it. It doesn't cause it.
Yeah. So it can, I suppose autistic people can sometimes react differently to trauma as well. So sometimes there can be a delayed response, sometimes something that maybe a neurotypical person wouldn't find traumatic, an autistic person might find extremely traumatic. I think it's always important to look at all the different facets around a person to really understand what's going on for them. But we know that it's not bad parenting or trauma that causes people to be autistic.
And I suppose how you parent an autistic child will very much impact on their outcomes and their quality of life. And most parents are doing their absolute best, right?
They are, yeah. And I think it's that that kind of way of thinking about our young people, thinking about parents, and, you know, learning from each other, learning from different parents, learning from the resources that are out there, from clinical professionals, from teachers, and thinking about how can you do this best. And you're never going to get it 100% right.
Is there a cure for autism? This is an uncomfortable question in a world striving for diversity. Listen in as we discuss some of the pressures autistic people face, the need for acceptance, and the importance of creating a world that understands and supports autistic lives.
Freya, how would you respond to people who are either seeking or believe that there is a cure for autism?
Okay, so first of all, there is no cure. So there is no kind of
magic pill.
There's no magic pill. There's no magic wand that will cure somebody. I have an issue with the word cure.
Same.
I find that it's a strange word that sort of sits uncomfortably with me. If you and I were having this conversation maybe 2 years ago, I would be sort of saying to you, no, I 100% don't think there should be a cure. And I used to go and do training for teams about autism, about neurodiversity. And I was talking about how I don't think there should be a cure because it's all about, you know, acceptance and celebration. And someone was really brave, and it was an autistic lady at the front. She put her hand up and she said, actually, when I was a teenager, my life was so hard and I faced so many barriers, and, you know, it impacted me. If there was a magic pill and there was a cure, then I would have taken that. And I think for me that was something, a real moment of learning for me to think, okay, yes, I am all about celebrating autism, and I will always do that. But I've also got to remember that sometimes being autistic is really, really challenging and is really, really difficult. And maybe there are sometimes autistic people out there who would absolutely love a cure, or love, again, another person said to me, I'd just like a pill that I could take 1 day a week. That if I had that for 1 day a week, I could have a chill day, or I could do the things that I need to do. And for me, it was just that ability to kind of look at things from all those different angles and understand it from lots of different perspectives. For me, if I think about what a cure really is, a cure is changing our environment to make it universally by design accessible for everybody who are, you know, neurodivergent or physically divergent, you know, whatever that is. I think a cure is helping people who aren't autistic understanding an autistic mind. It's about reasonable adaptions that you don't have to fight for. It's about reasonable adaptions in education. That way, that becomes the cure, but not the cure for autism. It becomes the cure for society, where we can actually live and celebrate difference rather than deficit.
And I think you're right. There is something slightly inflammatory about the word cure or fix, because by its definition, we're implying that autistic people need to be fixed or cured, that they're broken, that they're somehow less than the rest of society, which is offensive. It is. But as you were speaking then, I was thinking about my teenage years, and I was thinking, gosh, you know, yes, probably I would have said the same thing. Life was very, very difficult. And there is a reason why a lot of autistic people will have antidepressants or anti-anxiety medication, because that helps with the traits of autism that become very difficult to live with sometimes. And I've experienced myself well-meaning relatives sending me diets for the children, or supplements, or some dodgy pill from some godforsaken
hyperbaric
place.
oxygen chambers is a trend at the moment.
And in the end, I used to just kind of ignore it. And in the end, I did reply, and I said, actually, there's nobody in my house is ashamed of their autism or wants to cure it. So please stop. And I felt quite, I've advocated for myself. But that narrative, if you're hearing that enough, and I'm thinking particularly of children who are starting maybe to feel like they are a little bit different, and this acceptance of who you are and understanding who you are is so imperative at such a young age.
Yeah, it's that development of your identity.
Yeah, sense of self.
Yeah, definitely.
Do you grow out of autism? We tackle the myth that autistic children simply grow out of it, and understand how autonomy, experience, and supportive surroundings can make traits less visible, without ever changing the fact that autistic children become autistic adults.
What about growing out of it? Do you grow out of autism?
No, you don't. So again, I think that was there's a really lovely quote or sort of story by Temple Grandin, obviously an autistic advocate and researcher, a very famous lady. And she was sort of saying, well, I had childhood autism and now I'm grown up. So what does that make? What do I have now? And I think for me, it's that point really emphasises, autistic children grow up to be autistic adults. You might change. Things that you found difficult as a child might now be easy for you as an adult. Your autism doesn't stay static because you don't stay static. You change, you grow, you have new experiences. The people that you meet in your life change. Your life experiences change. So yeah, you definitely don't grow out of autism.
But you as you become an adult, you have more autonomy over your life. You can choose your clothes so they don't itch or scratch you. You can choose your food. You can choose your environment. And whereas at school, I'm thinking of school-age children, they're all sort of expected to behave exactly the same, and therefore you are going to see the differences more.
Yeah, and if you live in a world, where you feel really accepted, and if you have kind of created a really, I suppose, autism-friendly life, you almost grow into your autism because you may be able to, you can do all the things that you want to do. You can celebrate your intense interest. You can focus on those things. You can, if you don't like certain foods, you don't have to eat them anymore. If you don't like, going to loud parties, you don't have to do that anymore.
So it's a lot about autonomy and finding your place in the world.
Yeah, finding your tribe.
Yeah, very important.
Autistic people can't work. We're going on to challenge this misconception that limits opportunity for many individuals. Barriers like this can prevent participation when in reality, individual strengths, reasonable adaptations and flexible approaches can open the door to meaningful futures for so many.
Freya, what would you say to people who view autistic people as either not needing to work or not being able to work or having very prescriptive, limited career options?
Okay, so that's a really good thinking question, Rosie. I'm trying to... I think it's really important to do a few different things there. So one, let's not kind of pigeonhole autistic people into certain roles. So I think that's really important. So just because you're autistic doesn't mean you're going to be a maths whiz or...
I can confirm this.
Yes, or someone who's really great at technology. You might be creative. You might have all of those different things. So about 20% of autistic people are in paid employment. So that means about 80% of autistic adults are not in paid employment. And I think that statistic is really frightening. And I think that statistic is frightening for a number of reasons. One, it means that autistic people aren't having all the positives associated with having a job. So, being productive, having colleagues, having a place to go, having structure, contributing. But it also is really sad for our workplaces because our workplaces are missing out on vital employees who could contribute incredible fresh perspectives and ideas. So I think there's a few different bits. One, we need to make sure that autistic people are supported into what jobs they might want to do, are encouraged to aim for the stars, are not told, you've got a diagnosis of autism, so you won't ever be able to get a job. Tell somebody, okay, what job would you like? How can we help you? What are the steps we can help you take to get that job? What qualifications you need? And then once if you're going for interviews, what reasonable adaptations might you ask an employer for? Maybe you ask to see the questions in advance because because of your autism, your brain isn't great at processing things on the fly, but actually you're really good at being an in-depth thinker. And then when you start at a place of work, what reasonable adaptations, can your employer do to support you? And that might be something just as simple as allowing you to wear your noise-cancelling headphones when you're at your desk, or if someone's giving you an instruction, that it's also written down. So there's lots of little things that people can do.
Because I'm kind of hearing in this that it's not an unwillingness to work. It's a lot of it will be around the restrictions around traditional work. So office hours, 9 to 5, expected to be in the office, you're commuting in rush hour. These are all things that are going to be unhelpful for a lot of autistic people. And then if you talk about things like burnout, Well, if you're taking time off work because you're burnt out and your employer is not understanding, you stand to possibly lose your job. So it might not be the actual job itself. It's more likely to be the external kind of bits around it.
Yeah.
So
definitely.
things like working from home, that must have had a good impact, you think.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting. So again, I'm talking to lots of different autistic people. I'll talk to someone who'll be like, do you know what, working from home has been absolutely game-changing for me. It means that I can focus, I can do my, when I want, how I want, it's a quiet environment, all of those things. And I've talked to other autistic people who are like, oh, working from home was the worst thing for me because I loved the routine of going to work, sitting at my desk, seeing my colleagues. I liked that part of my day and I felt I missed that when I was working from home. So again, it's about coming back to that, the good old chestnut of being an individual and talking to, what people need, how they, what's going to benefit them most.
But a little bit of flexibility from employers, as you're talking, I was thinking, even if they started work half an hour later, so you're avoiding the massive rush of traffic, there are so many reasonable adaptations that can be made.
And so many of them aren't even expensive. They're just little shifts and changes that can have a massive impact on someone's life. I worked with a gentleman once who was working somewhere and the office policy was that you had to have lunch in the break room. And he said, I just don't want to have lunch in the break. It's a social job. He was talking to other people and customers as part of his role. And he said, I need that lunch hour or my half-hour lunch. I just want to go and sit and eat my lunch in silence in my car. And that was a reasonable adaptation that we were able to write to his, when we did his diagnosis and put that into his report as a reasonable adaptation for a workplace. That doesn't change, that doesn't impact what his productivity is, but it allows him
Probably
to be.
Enhances it. And I think so much of this is about people not knowing what they are entitled to or what they can ask for. Because if you read the office policy and you see that, and then particularly if you take things quite literally, then you think, well, I can't question this. This is the rule. Yeah. And of course, it doesn't hurt to ask, does it?
It doesn't hurt to ask, no, definitely. And talk to your line manager or someone you feel really comfortable in about work, about your diagnosis. And think about what could they do to help.
Neurodivergent superpower. The idea of superpowers can be unhelpful when it sets unrealistic expectations for autistic people. Listen in as we discuss celebrating what makes each person special, whether it's a unique talent, interest, or kindness, and why this is more meaningful than looking for extraordinary abilities.
Freya, have you got a superpower?
Oh, I have loads of superpowers.
How do we feel about this term? Let's talk about superpowers and this idea that everybody who is neurodivergent has a superpower. And what people might mean by that. Is it the ability to recall the entire phone book? Is it the ability to do complex maths equations in your head? And what happens if you're autistic and you can't do those things?
Yeah. So again, I don't think these things are ever said out of malice or, like you said, so it often is a very complimentary thing. Oh, if you're autistic, what's your amazing talent or what's your superpower? And if you're an autistic person who doesn't really have a particular strength, you might feel like a bit of a deficient autistic person because you don't have, the sort of classic Dustin Hoffman from Rain Man ability to count the toothpicks on the floor, or you don't have the skill of, like you were saying, counting numbers or whatever. So I think it can be unhelpful, again, to broad brush people in that way. I like to think about it rather than saying, okay, so what's your superpower? So it'd be like, okay, so what makes you special? We all have things that make us special. It doesn't have to be a specific talent, a superpower. It doesn't have to be something, incredibly impressive. It might just be, actually what makes me special is I'm a really good friend. Or what makes me special is I really love and care for animals and I go out of my way to, feed the...
class guinea pig.
Yeah, whatever it is. So lots of those different things. I think for me, it's about how you phrase these things, the words that you use. And, if somebody says, actually, do you know what, I do have a superpower, then I would be like, oh my goodness, so tell me about your superpower. What is it? And if that's something that is really meaningful for them, and it might be a young person who says, well, do you know what, and I've worked with lots of people who have got incredible talents, and I would call them superpowers because they're things that I could never do. But again, that's not the same for everybody. It might be that somebody can do an amazing realistic drawing. It might be that somebody knows so much knowledge about their intense interest.
Pokemon,
yeah. So I think it's, rather than what's your superpower or what's your talent, what makes you special.
And it's about bringing it back down into an obtainable level. So you might not be able to play the piano fluently blindfolded, but you are a really good reader.
Yeah.
Or you are really good at baking toast. I don't know what it could be, something really simple, but just something that they can identify as something that makes them special or brings them joy.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Definitely.
Autistic people won't live fulfilling lives. Finally, we challenge the myth that autistic people can't live fulfilling lives when the right individualised support can make it possible for autistic people to build meaningful relationships and lead joyful lives on their own terms.
Freya, what about this idea that autistic people won't live fulfilling and independent lives? Is that a myth?
I'd say that's a myth as well. I think there's an element of a myth to that. I think there's an element of truth, because there will be some autistic people who have additional needs, maybe learning needs, that won't be able to live independently, but they will still 100% be able to live a fulfilling life.
And you can have one without the other, right?
You can definitely, yeah. You can have an absolutely wonderful, joy-filled, fulfilling life. And you don't necessarily have to live independently for that. But again, there are lots of autistic people out there who will live independently, who will succeed, who will thrive. And I don't mean that in a sort of, again, overarching, amazing, sort of, high flying, doing all bells and whistles. I think it's just, having a family, maybe having a career. Having some friends, having pets.
Yeah.
Doing the things that brings people joy.
That's it for today's episode. Huge thanks to Freya for helping me tackle some of the biggest myths on autism. These misconceptions might seem small on the surface, but they can have a massive impact, especially when they lead to people being misunderstood, unsupported, or simply dismissed. If anything we talked about today gave you pause or challenged something you thought you knew, that's a good thing. Learning and unlearning is part of the work, and you're not alone in that. As always, if this episode resonated with you, please consider subscribing, sharing it with someone who might benefit, or just leaving us a quick review. It really helps more people find Autism Unpacked, and more importantly, it helps our voices be heard. Until next time, take care and be kind to yourself. I'll be back with you soon for more unpacking.